This time on Poll Hub, the Iowa caucuses are coming, and so are the Iowa polls. But polling caucus-goers is a tricky business, which may help explain why not all the polls are singing exactly the same tune. We are digging in to explain why, so let's get to it. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm Jay DeDapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho, Director of the Marist Poll.
And I'm Miringoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion.
Before we talk about Iowa, something happened in Iowa this week. Somebody lied to accuse somebody of being a liar or something. No,
Let's not talk about it now.
I know, we're not going to talk about that.
We'll talk about that later.
So,
not
big
here.
debate. The debate, often the first debate in a primary season is watched a lot, and then the last one before voters actually get to do something, and that's this Iowa debate. Thoughts? Everybody watched? What'd you think?
Well, I thought the debate was interesting to the point where it was very substantive, but as we know, very often it was the fisticuffs at the end between Sanders and Warren that sort of was the takeaway.
That's one of them. I mean, It's gotten a lot of coverage, but in the political press, I'm not sure that everybody pays that much attention to that.
Yeah, but I felt, that's the thing you saw on the news afterwards, and and look, that created, if anything, I'm thinking look, in Iowa, being second best sometimes matters because the rules require at each individual caucus that you have to have a 15% threshold to be viable. So if you don't have that, people start shopping for other candidates. That may have explained why during the debate it was less combative during the debate itself between the candidates than more of a love fest because they want, they don't want to be the bad person for the other guy's second choice.
Yeah, is it likely to make any difference, though?
Although, you mentioned who was watching, Jay, and I was a little surprised that it, although viewership did tick up, that it seems that people are kind of a little tired, or at least interest has waned in the Democratic primaries debates. Certainly since the first one last June, but I was a little surprised that there wasn't higher viewership. I didn't expect it to be, at the level of, Ken Jennings winning, the greatest of all time title
Do we think
on Jeopardy?
impeachment is doing anything to that? I mean, it will take the three of the senators off the campaign trail. Is it creating a sort of a other major story, maybe even a more important story?
Well, remember this, we're talking about Iowa right now. Iowa caucus goers are going to be the first ones to vote. Yep. If caucus going is voting, which it kind of is. You stick your hand up. That this debate was really aimed at Iowa because for some of the candidates, Elizabeth Warren in particular, if she doesn't win in Iowa, it's hard to see where the path forward is. It's a little less important perhaps for some other candidates, but I mean, she's one of the top four. If Pete Buttigieg came in fourth or fifth in Iowa, I mean, does he have any place to go after that? So I think it's easy for us to see this in a national way and to watch it from where we watch it from, doing national polls and also doing state polls. But our perspective, I think, is very different from the campaign's perspective.
Yes.
And from Iowa caucus goers.
And Buttigieg is spending a lot of time in Iowa. I think the
really
campaign
matters.
certainly knows that it's a make or break for him because it's his opportunity to show that he is a vote getter and that he can play in those leagues. I thought it was interesting to have so few candidates, and I know it seems weird because in the past,
is so few.
6 candidates, seemed overwhelming, and now it's, quote, whittled down to 6. Yeah. But I think it did allow more attention to each of the candidates. I've always, I know, Lee, you keep waiting for Amy Klobuchar to kind of,
yes.
Jump in front and have her moment. But I don't think that really happened.
It didn't happen. She's gotten
around.
into sort of like the leader of the second tier, and that, unfortunately for her, are the candidates who are not making the debate cutoff.
And Steyer's biggest moment was the fact that he, went to say hello to, or goodbye to Warren and Sanders when they were having their tiff. But I think it's also very awkward that, what comes out of the debate is this kind of rift between Warren and Sanders. And again, we focus so much on the horse race and kind of the tit for tat kind of discussions. I think more importantly, I thought Elizabeth Warren was somewhat uncomfortable talking about foreign policy. I don't think that's really her comfort zone. I think she shines much more when she's talking about domestic policy, particularly health policy. Buttigieg, obviously is a great debater and always seems like the real smart kid in the class.
Yeah, very conversational.
And Biden, Biden was Biden. I don't think he really hurt himself. I don't think he helped himself. But as a front runner, probably just being boring isn't a bad thing.
Yeah, let me sort of change this around, because I had a little bit of a revelation the last couple of weeks, and we were talking about this around the office, that my perception was that the Iowa caucus folks would vote, and then New Hampshire would often correct the First Nation primary, would correct what Iowa did. And so then we were looking back at previous Iowa caucus events for the Democrats and found, to my surprise really, that the winner of the Iowa caucus for the Democrats in a contested primary, a contested election, which takes away the 1992 Harkin one because he was the favorite son, the last time that person, the winner in Iowa, did not go on to win the Democratic nomination was 1988, when Dick Gephardt was the caucus winner and didn't get the nomination. Every time since then, the winner of Iowa has been the nominee. Now, I know 1988 is an interesting year in your resume.
Yeah, well, that was my first caucus covering it as a reporter.
In Iowa. Iowa. So you were on the ground
I was on
there.
the ground with all those guys, yeah. Well, remember that there were several favorite sons there. Paul Simon came in second. He was from neighboring Illinois. Gephardt was Missouri, just south. So I think that's maybe not the... I think there are probably asterisks involved in that one as well. What's interesting, though, is that what doesn't happen for the Democrats, New Hampshire isn't correcting. It does happen for Republicans over and over. New Hampshire is, in fact, a corrector, if you want to use that word, for what they do in Iowa.
Because Republican winners of the caucus very often don't go anywhere.
Yeah. Right. There's some extremism, if you will, that Iowa Republican caucus goers seem to be more inclined to follow than they do once you get to New Hampshire and then even South Carolina.
But the Iowa Democrats have the reputation of being extremely liberal, yet the
that's not borne
nominee
out.
doesn't end up being that candidate. And the winner very often, the Garys of the world and others have not been that.
I think that's a misperception that Iowa Democrats are somehow crazy liberals who go to the caucuses and vote for them. And I think it stems from 1976, the first caucus that anybody ever paid attention to, when Jimmy Carter actually didn't finish first, uncommitted finished first. But Jimmy Carter, who was some peanut governor from Georgia, who the heck is this guy, against some very formidable Democratic, hardcore candidates, and he comes in a really wide second. I mean, he's way ahead of everybody else, and that's why I think people think that the Democrats in Iowa are traditionally very liberal, and it just doesn't bear it.
So it's the conventional wisdom then about the Iowa Democrats and what winning Iowa means for the Democratic nomination doesn't really stand up, at least not from my perspective. Then the other line that we hear also very often is, there's 3 tickets out of Iowa. You got to punch 3 tickets out of Iowa for the Democrats. You have to finish first, second, or third. So is that also what's being determined? You sort of have to be in the top 3?
I think that's very different depending on the year and look, this is a lot of the rules are gone that we have followed in the past. One is how many candidates are on a stage or on a ballot. I mean, we went from, remember what they called the candidates in 1988, the Democratic field.
Yes.
What did they call it?
7 dwarfs.
The 7 dwarfs, because there were 7 candidates.
Outrageous.
An outrageous number. There were, 19 Republicans in 2016. There's, 140 Democrats this year, whatever the
But it's winnowed down.
It was only 23,
We've had the first
at its
primary,
peak.
and the first primary was winnowed out by whether you qualified in the polls and whether you raised enough money.
Understood,
that was sort of the first primary.
But the 6 that were on stage are not the 6. There are more than 6 remaining. There are more than 6 that are going to be represented there in Iowa. So my point is that the rules about these things, I think, have really been rewritten, especially since 2016 and both the Democratic and Republican campaigns. And I think that's true this time around, too. I don't think you need to finish third to get out of this alive. It depends on who you are. If Bernie Sanders finishes 4th, it's not the end of his campaign. He's got more money than anybody else. And he could finish 4th.
Although for the candidates who have not been polling well and were not on the stage, there still is a threshold at the caucus,
Right.
and so that will be telling.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because that threshold thing is one of the reasons, and we talked about at the beginning about Iowa polling, caucus polling, and what makes it so difficult is that and I want to start with this and then we can get into the polling. Just to make it clear about a caucus, and I've been to a bunch of them, I've sat there, I've watched this a bunch of times. Basically, everybody in a community, in a smallish neighborhood, will join, say, in a cafeteria of a junior high school. That was one of my favorites because they were all sitting on these folding tables and there was spilled milk all over from the kids. It was great. And they everybody makes a speech about a candidate, and then go to your corner with the candidate you prefer. And if a candidate doesn't reach a 15% threshold of the number of people in that room, so if 100 people show up and 14 people are standing there for, say, a Wesley Clark in 2008, what year was Clark? 2008? 2004. Sorry. Yeah, Judd Gray. If he doesn't reach 15%, so there's only 14 people, those 14 people have to go somewhere else. And so that mechanism means that when you're polling, it's very likely that people are picking a candidate that will not actually be the candidate they end up siding with. That's one thing that makes these Iowa polls difficult to do. Talk about the most recent Iowa polls and what some of the challenges are.
Let me jump in on that point just for a second, then we'll go to the polls. Okay. Often the so-called exit polls that we know so much about out of other states,
or the right, yes,
in Iowa is very often an entrance poll, because that's the point where the different candidates have support, even if they don't have 15%,
right.
They get in there. So that will be the one that picks up the low numbers. And very often that's sort of what determines the popular caucus vote winner coming out of Iowa. And the real count among the delegates, and after the 15% realignment, that kind of gets lost as the campaign moves on very often.
It depends how quickly Iowa counts the caucus results.
Yeah,
last time around in 2016, when we had Sanders and Clinton, there were only two candidates.
Right.
So it was kind of, the results were in real time. In fact, we found out that they were tied, and it was the flip of the coin, which Clinton won. But Lee makes a good point. When there is a crowded field, the way we find out about, quote, who won the Iowa caucus is from the entrance poll. And so it won't necessarily take that 15% into account. And it's often what the pre-election polls are judged by.
Paul Simon thought in 1988 that he probably actually won, but didn't because of this dynamic.
But then there are the final numbers released by the party, and in the case of 2016, the Republicans in 2016, they released those numbers. They were overnight, and Santorum, it turned out, had a slightly bigger win than anybody had thought.
So after all this hoopla,
the
actual count.
Under the
let's get to the polls.
The topic of be careful what you wish for. We were just bemoaning the fact that there had not been a lot of polls out just last week.
Right.
And as soon as the words, were out of our mouth, we were inundated with lots of Iowa polls.
Right.
Showing somewhat different results.
Right. So Monmouth has Biden at 24, Sanders at 18, Buttigieg at 17, Warren at 15. The Des Moines Register, CNN, Mediacom poll, which is the Ann Seltzer poll, and she's known as the really gold standard of Iowa polling, been doing it a long time, goes to a lot of trouble to work up what she perceives to be a great sample, and it is challenging. We'll talk about it. Sanders at 20, Warren at 17, Buttigieg at 16, Biden at 15.
The big difference in that is Biden's number.
Biden is 10 points lower than in the Monmouth poll, and in fourth place, not first place. And then the CBS YouGov poll, which uses a very different type of polling methodology, Sanders at 23, Biden at 23, Buttigieg at 23, that's convenient, and Warren at 16. So there's three polls with really wildly divergent results in this 15 to 25% range. Why?
Well, I mean, you can attribute a good amount of it to just sampling error. The idea that polls are estimates, and so when you look at those estimates, they can vary within a range. But as you point out, not all of it. I think the biggest difference is probably the the Monmouth poll, the difference between Biden and the Monmouth poll and the Des Moines Register poll. Biden getting 24, as you pointed out, in first place in the Monmouth poll, but being in fourth place in the Des
So why
Moines
is
Register
that different
poll.
methodology?
There's a couple of different things. Did you want to jump in, Lee? You said sampling,
Well,
and
just,
it is
just
absolutely.
there's different, a lot of what we've talked about on many podcasts, and this article I'm looking at right now was by last week's guest on podcast Poll Hub, Nate Cohn, who did a estimation of why things might have been different. And one of the things that he was pointing out there was that different methods of picking who makes it into your poll. And in the Monmouth case, there was, drawn from a list, prior vote mattered.
Sampling frame.
Sampling frame.
We call that the list of voters is actually the sampling frame.
And he was taking in that poll. Pat Murray was the list of Democrats, the list of independents, and heavy emphasis on prior vote. The Seltzer poll from the Des Moines Register looked at all registered voters because there are some Republicans who can jump into this if they so choose, and wasn't as eager to weed out people who had not participated in prior caucus events. Because what we've seen in many of these is there's been a surprising surge in turnout. Barack Obama had it.
Well, that was the highest ever. That was 40%. There's never been anything like that
Bernie
before.
Sanders outperformed because of the...
But it was a 30% turnout in 2016.
Yeah.
It was 23% in 2004. The Monmouth poll assumes that of 1,033 likely caucus-goers, they're assigning 405 of them as likely to go. That's 40% turnout.
Yeah, so
that's a brave prediction, I would say.
Yeah, but the thing I thought was interesting in Nate Cohn's analysis was that there was an 8% fewer inclusion in the Monmouth poll than in the Seltzer poll, and most of those people were younger men and people without college, groups that would be more likely to go for Sanders. It doesn't explain everything, but it's just kind of like a different sampling method, and that creates some in addition to the margin.
So the other thing here is that, and Barb talked to this because this is the nuts and bolts of polling that people don't necessarily get. We're 4 weeks out, right? 3 weeks out. 1 is field dates. 2 is people change their minds. 3 is there's all these candidates in there. There's just a whole lot in here that makes these polls not terribly predictive or relevant right now. Give me the one that comes out the day before. But right now,
that's
people
true,
shouldn't bet a lot on this.
But I actually think that the polls right now are giving us a good sense of what the race is, because we're just we're really just a few weeks out. And up until this point, I think it was, interesting in Nate's article, he kind of hearkened back to an October poll that he had done with the Siena poll. And his analysis was mostly based on that, trying to understand the difference between in Biden's support between those two polls. But I think right now is actually a good time to be looking at these polls. These are all, YouGov is a different methodology, and it remains to be seen, whether they can get a sense of the tight races. They're great when races are not contested. It's an online methodology which requires a lot of modeling and assumptions. But Monmouth and
right now,
CNN
Barbara, if
Seltzer,
they have 3 people at 23%, they're likely to get a winner. Just saying.
Well, maybe not the right number, though. So I think the Monmouth and the Seltzer polls are really serious efforts. One of the things that we have seen is that this idea of sampling and frame. In other words, where are you getting the phone numbers for the people who you're going to contact in the poll is a really, really big deal. And what our polling has been showing is that the more you try to work at making it productive and more cost efficient, meaning you go to lists like registered voters and you make assumptions about who's going to vote, the less representative the sample tends to be. And so you have these 2 different methodologies going in. I think we will see, whether they get, I don't believe that this is going to be their last poll. that they're likely to have one much closer. But I think it's certainly an interesting exercise for us pollsters, and I think for folks who are kind of watching this to see who is ahead and who is behind. We've got a number of candidates that are really tightly matched in this state.
Right.
And it's going to be an interesting
But also
night.
keep in mind that 3 and 4 weeks out, less so on the Democratic side, much more on the Republican side. The leader in even Ann Seltzer's Des Moines Register poll has not been the person who has won. There are late deciders. There's persuasion that goes on.
Exactly.
Now, she did, to be fair, from the Democrats, she had Obama winning even a month out by a little bit in 2008, and in 2016, she had Clinton winning by 2, but Clinton won, but in a tie. So that was
a coin flip.
In a very tight
Literally.
race. But 2004, Gephardt was ahead. Dean was in second. Kerry was in third. Kerry won.
Yes.
And I just wonder if this is not more similar to 2004, where there were a lot of candidates, than it is to 2008 or 2016, when there were many fewer candidates.
So I think we can say the bottom line right now is it's very close. There's an awful lot of potential caucus voters who are still likely to change their mind, and the late deciders could be as far as when you actually get into the caucus and they start to realign. But I
also
the
think
late
a lot of
decisions.
people are going to vote, and
Yes.
I think this time when we're looking at likely voters and we see higher numbers, I think those actually may be real.
Let's hope so. It's not a bad thing.
No.
Absolutely.
But
not.
I'm always doubtful of projections
think
of
there's
extremely high turnout. I'm always
I
doubtful.
think there's a lot of energy this time.
And so that will do it for this edition of Poll Hub. Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York. Mary Griffith, sitting to my right, is our executive producer, and Casey Schaff in the other room will be getting this to edit.
It's nice that you're locating this for the
think it's
people
important.
listening in their headphones, trying to picture exactly.
Gives a
what-
visual component.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll start a video feed of this someday so you can watch
Ooh,
us.
can't wait.
Oh, no, that's a bad idea. Well, thanks also to the
You're
Roper
getting
Center.
a Hawkeye from Mary right now, and we were talking about the Hawkeye State, incidentally.
That was a stretch. Yeah. Thanks to the Roper Center Archive at Cornell University for providing us with the ability to look back at survey questions and results over the decades. We tap into that an awful lot, as you know. And if you have questions or comments, reach out to us on social media. We're at Marist Poll on Twitter, Marist Poll on Facebook, and on Instagram.
And of course, if you want to learn a lot more about polling and the things we talk about each week, check out our online learning platform, the Marist Poll Academy. It's free. Finally, if you'd like what you hear on Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review on your podcasting app of choice. Positive reviews will help us, help others find us too. And while you're at it, go ahead and subscribe.